Hi everyone, welcome to the second Agora Europe event here at Columbia University. This event is titled Migration in the European Political Space, the Future is at the Borders. This event and the one we had yesterday were co-sponsored by the European Institute, which I thank, the Columbia University Maison Française, the Hyman Center for the Humanities, the event yesterday, and also the Columbia European Society and the Alliance Program. So thank you all institutions for having put this together. I would also like to thank, especially here at the European Institute, at the European Institute of François Carabia and Sharon Kim for having helped us to put this together, and here at the Maison Française, Shani Peer and Alex Cutler. Also, I'd like to thank the two co-organizers of this Agora Europe series, Etienne Balibar, who is here with us, and Nadia Rubinati, who unfortunately couldn't make it here today. And I'd also like to add a short line on the fact that at the moment of sending the invitations, we actually make sure we're respecting the criteria of diversity. Unfortunately, a few people had to cancel in the last week, so we're not exactly equal. And I'm just going to mention them. So Nadia Rubinati, as I said, couldn't make it here today. Julia Austin also had to cancel last minute. Lydia Gore, Jim Cohen, and finally Suleiman Bashir Diane. So that's just to make sure that no mistake has been done. Today we're going to talk about migration and Europe. Yesterday we had an event on Czech philosopher Jan Patočka and Charles 77. This is part of a series. Of a series called the Agora Europe series on the European political space. This series started right after I defended my dissertation at Sorbonne. So I should also say that I just defended my dissertation at Sorbonne. I've been a visiting scholar here at Columbia for 2 years and a half. The visiting scholar program is ending, and this is obviously a very good way to end it. So the idea at the beginning for my dissertation was to somehow attempt to give an account of the political space from both a political and a philosophical perspective. Once having done this, I thought to do a first event, and Etienne and Nadia helped me to put this together. That was at the Sorbonne on the 25th of May this year. And that should have been just one single event on the European political space. It had become a series. So we had the second event yesterday here at the Hyman Center. We're having an event here today. The series is going to continue at the University of Bologna on October 19th, at UCL, University College London on October 29th, then at the University of Oxford, European University Institute, San Raffaele, and it's really going everywhere in Europe and elsewhere. And you can, of course, be updated if you look at our website or Facebook or Twitter page. So first of all, why an Agora, and also why an Agora on the European political space? So the idea of calling it an Agora was to have a format that's a bit different from the one of the conference, not to have a conference in which everyone is speaking maybe for a long time. We have just a little bit of a moment for questions and answers at the end, but to actually involve the public, the audience, to make it open to both politicians and academics and citizens, to have very short, as you shall see, talks from the speakers and a very long discussion with the audience afterwards. That was the idea, to make it really an Agora and to make it as public as possible. The second thing is why we call it the European political space. So the last crisis we're facing in Europe in this moment, Etienne is going to talk about this, and most importantly the economic crisis and the so-called refugee crisis are probably showing us with a bit more evidence the fact that we never really could characterize Europe as a political space, so we could never really think of Europe as a political space. Europe has always been missing, in a way, a political dimension. So the attempt to do this Agora was to bring together, as I said, academics, citizens, students, and everyone to talk about the possible political dimension of Europe, and also to talk about how each single European country can somehow help in reorganizing and in reshaping the European political space. So that was the main idea. So today we're going to talk about Europe at the beginning, then we're going to have a second session, we're going to have a discussion with you, of course, and then a second session on migration, where we're going to talk about the so-called refugee crisis. We're going to try to define the borders which characterize our identity, and we're going to try to be a bit more critical probably about the last policies we have seen in the last affairs we have seen, such as the one of the Paris. We have a convinced that the best policy we had on migration, vis-a-vis migration, was the one made by Tony Abbott in Australia a few years ago, which was the stop the boat policy. So we're going to talk about all of these, borders, migration, in the second session. Now, I should not say more, and I should ask Etienne Balibar to introduce to us the 4 dimensions of the European crisis. Etienne is among the most influential contemporary political philosophers and one of the most important Marxist scholars. He's here as visiting professor in Department of French and Philology. He's also chair professor at the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy at Kingston College, and of course, emeritus professor at Paris Nanterre. Among his publications, I'd like to remind Politics and the Other Scene, 2002, and We, the People of Europe, Reflections on Transnational Citizenship. Please, Etienne.
Thank you, Caterina. Thank you so much. Okay, we are allowed, and justly so, a very short time. Therefore, how many minutes did you say?
8.
8 minutes. Okay, so that leads me to there. No, to there. Okay. So as you will see, this is not a talk. It's something like a statement. But because I am the first speaker, and in a sense as she said, I cooperated with Caterina and Nadia and some others in trying to imagine the content and the function of these meetings. I see myself rather on the side of introducers than guests, and I very much hope to hear what the others have to say in reaction. I have been now for quite a bit of time considered as a pessimist in European matters, after having perhaps given the impression that I was a naive optimist. And you will feel that. It's on purpose. Of course, that doesn't, we all have the famous Gramsci formula in mind. It's not because I'm a pessimist that I'm intelligent, or better said, I'm not sure about how much intelligence pessimism can give in such circumstances. We'll see. Allow me to speak as the citizen of a non-existent federation. Some years ago, I would have said, it is non-existent, but it is virtual. I mean, it's not yet actual, but it is virtual, because it is in construction, of course, with many obstacles and internal and external conflicts. In construction, if not inevitable, nothing is inevitable in history. Today, I'm forced to say, because these virtualities did not materialize, because they were in fact destroyed or dismantled from outside or under the impact of external forces and events, changes, dramatic events in the history of the world in the last decades, but especially from inside. They seem to have met their end themselves, their termination. In terms of reversing that fatal trend, I declare that what you see are appearances, even if some can be interesting, striking. Example, and we may have to return to that. So I was reading today's New York Times, and of course I went through an article in which John Bolton, President Trump's close advisor in matters of diplomacy and international affairs, is very angry protest in a virulent manner because the European Union has decided to set up an institutional and financial administration or institution that would allow European firms in all sorts of fields to continue commercing, making affairs with Iran in spite of the... it's amazing. He says they should not be allowed to break what we have decided or what we have ordered or something like that. And of course, when you read that, you are tempted to say, okay, the European Union is there, so it's resistant. I say that what you see are appearances. They belong not to the future, but to the past. European unity or construction as a construction of the European peoples themselves is a future past. I'm sure that Mr. Moscovici, who spoke here yesterday, has said just the opposite. But Mr. Moscovici is wrong, and above all, he played himself a significant role in burying Europe's future. I'm ready to demonstrate that. And yet, the European problem is not resolved by this reversal of virtualities into unconciliable antagonisms and critical developments. Because it is not, in fact, a mere question of discovering that hopes, expectations were false hopes, illusory expectations which did not survive a reality test. It is a question of a battle that should be fought and was provisionally lost. A battle whose stakes are primarily not to defeat an enemy, although there are many enemies of the European federal idea on many sides, but to define its objectives and forces to find a new language of transnational politics. This was never given and granted. And the problem is not resolved also and primarily because the people and the peoples, in the plural, of Europe, if you like, the demos and the demoi, as our colleague Calypso Nicolaidis uses to say, are facing, as a consequence of this common failure, immediate and long-term challenges on both domestic and global issues in the fields of democracy, social security, civility, or even culture, above all culture maybe, that can be only addressed collectively in common if they are to be really treated. So a battle has been lost, and it is unconditionally necessary that we understand why, that we analyze the reasons to the roots, going to the roots, not only in terms of the strengths of the adversaries of European federalism, but in terms of the tragic weaknesses of its own supporters. I was and I remain convinced that the European problem can be addressed only in the perspective of European federalism, or Europe's federal idea, because the idea of a Europe of nations, de Gaulle's famous Europe des Nations that is now reclaimed everywhere, even Trump has said that's what you should do, where nations, especially the most powerful or the less vulnerable, take everything and give nothing in exchange, is already inconsistent. But the idea of a Europe of nationalisms is simply absurd. However, I have become more uncertain than I used to be regarding the concept and the material constitution, to use a post-Schmittian category which is of great value in these matters, of a possible European federation. At the same time, I believe, and even I believe to observe, that the entanglement of interests and the generality or commonality of conflicts, political debates, etc., in the European space are such that their confrontation, and I should perhaps add the Euro-Mediterranean space, again, if we go to the roots, continuously resurrects the question of the European Federation, what its structures and rules should be, how it could become the common cause of Europeans or many Europeans. This is true, I'm done. This is true for the question of migrations and human rights, which will be our main topic later today. But it is also true for the question of nationalism, populism, and democracy, which we will certainly not be able to completely separate from the former. It is true for social and economic problems that are revealed by Brexit and will persist on both sides of the channel in whichever modality of isolation or pseudo-isolation of the Isles is taking place. And in fact, I think there will be no isolation. There will be. Above all, it is true for the financial problems that arise from the contradiction, the huge contradiction between the monetarist logic of the euro currency and the uneven development of nations and regions, as was dramatically and remains dramatically illustrated by the case of Greece. The project of Agora Europe that Caterina Di Fazio and her friends are launching, as I understand it, is a project not to just defend an idea in the abstract, to just resist what many of us perceive as a setback or a regression, but it is a project to seize each and every of the sides, the objects of the European crisis, to involve different generations and different nationalities of participants, both from inside and outside Europe, because the future of Europe is not a purely European problem, far from, and we need the gaze from outside, or we need to expatriate our own gaze, and of course not only to the United States, but they are and remain very privileged as a place of encounter. In order to, as I said, go to the root of the contradictions and in, like it or not, a perfect dialectical method, derive from these continued discussions elements of resolution, better said of invention, perhaps guidelines for a new manifesto di Ventotene, as several of us have suggested in the last period, Altiero Spinelli's great initiative in the 1940s. This is why I have enthusiastically supported the project and why I expect so much from this debate tonight and the following ones. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Etienne. And I should also mention that we're in contact with the city of Ventotene to do an event there, and it should be a very symbolic event to somehow renew and recreate some sort of manifesto di Ventotene. And also, I think it's very important to describe this crisis like a fourth dimension crisis. So as you said, so we have the migration crisis, of course, we have Brexit, we have populism now, pretty much everywhere in Europe, and Central East, and in Italy, of course, and we have the economic crisis. And the Agora Europe project is intended to have a session on each one of these topics. Of course, those on Brexit are going to be in London and Oxford. So now it's Silvana Patriarca that is going to tell us something more about Europe. Silvana has taught at Columbia University and the University of Florida, and is currently a professor in the Department of History at Fordham University here in New York City. She specializes in the history of modern Italy and the construction of national identities and their intersection with gender and race. She's the author of award-winning Numbers and Nationhood, Writing Statistics in 19th Century Italy. She has also had fellowships at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina, here at the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies, and at the EHESS and École Pratique des Études in Paris, Sorbonne. Please.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. I'm not a political scientist, I'm a historian, and so as a historian I hope you will indulge me if I go back a moment in history to recall what was considered in the early 19th century gospel of political democracy, namely the French Constitution of 1793. A constitution, to be sure, that was never implemented because of the terror and then of the reaction to the terror. The Constitution enshrined the principle of jus soli and established that a foreigner was entitled to the rights of French citizenship if he, and of course the subject was male at the time, was domiciled in France for a year, lived by his labor or acquired property, or married a French woman, or adopted a child, or maintained an old man, or if it was considered by the legislature as deserving well of humanity. This liberal conception of citizenship was, to be sure, very ephemeral. National and cultural citizenship and various forms of jus sanguinis came to shape citizenship laws all over Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. And today, most, if not all, European countries which are members of the EU have citizenship laws that make acquisition of citizenship for non-EU members very difficult. They certainly do not help immigrants to be part of European societies, to say the least. So I think that the big problem of Europe is not so much immigration, and here I'm addressing in this panel both Europe and immigration, as it is racism, which predates immigration from the global south, even if this immigration has accentuated it. Most Europeans have borders and walls in their minds, mental borders which the entrepreneur fears, as we all know, from Orban to Salvini, Le Pen, and so on, have steered for quite some time. We've been talking about these themes for a lot of years. With these people in power, the situation for migrants is particularly dire, especially if they have a dark skin. They steer appalling hostility against people who do not conform to the Semitic norm of their countries. They have established a new hegemony in Europe. Even now that the flow of refugees has declined, the anti-migrant refugee sentiment has increased, that has contributed to the gains of right-wing parties. How did we go to this pretty terrible moment in European history? To be sure, there have been many others, but this is not much of a consolation. I think that the EU itself, as it is part of the problem. Leaving aside the question of its democratic deficit, by now what most Europeans know about the European Union is essentially its economic policies and monetary policies, and they have been bad. They have brought us to this position here. The bloc's monetary policy have exacerbated divisions among member states and brought about exactly the resurgence of the nationalism that we all witnessed. So the right-wing populist movement, which have grown in places like Italy, are the products of this situation. They have grown as a response not just to immigration, but to the neoliberal and austerity policy of the past several years. And they have grown also because the so-called left parties have pretty much ceased being parties of the left. They have either collaborated with the center-right parties or have themselves implemented right-wing policies. I have in mind, in particular, the Renzi government in Italy, but the same could be said for other social democratic parties. This is what differentiates the current historical moment from the one in which Europe saw the rise of fascist parties in the early 20th century. Then fascist parties emerged against a strong labor movement, but now they rise in the absence of one, or more precisely, after the so-called representatives of the left have been implementing right-wing policies in economic and social matters. However, without a functioning left, we have a hard time fighting racism. And what can we do with this? What can we do to resurrect the left? It's certainly not an easy task, since the patient has committed suicide multiple times. At least in Italy, since 1989, we have seen it dying of its own hands multiple times. So this is just one more time recently that we have seen this, and it actually in a much worse form. So this is not something that one can do, of course, around the table, but in the absence of an actual movement in society. So I'll toss around just a couple of points. And again, I have in mind the Italian scene in particular, because it's the one that I know the best and the one that worries me the most, I must say. The first one is that the left must be populist again or abandon any pretense of being a left. Left-leaning parties will have to regain some credibility with their traditional voters by proposing real left-wing programs, namely some concrete material objective for the people who have been hurt by globalization and by neoliberal policies. While always defending the right of asylum, the left must also recognize that immigration right now is extremely unpopular, not only on the right, but also among its traditional voters. And I come originally from a small town in northern Italy, which has been essentially dominated by the Northern League, and now it's called the League politicians, for the past quarter century. And recently talking to, I sort of follow closely local politics, and talking to people on the left, they told me that they know quite a lot of people who, did not vote maybe Northern League, but they voted for the populist movement Cinque Stelle. And they actually share a lot, and this movement is also anti-immigration, and they share a lot of the same ground. They just feel less ashamed to vote for such a movement than to vote for the Northern League. So we do feel, and we do have a real problem. If we want to change Europe, that is, we do need to recreate some kind of credible left. So left-wing democratic parties so far have had huge problems addressing the issue, and have increasingly moved to the right on it, accepting the securitarian approach. But there has to be a way to address the fears of ordinary people, and at the same time to be clear about our obligation to help humans in need, no matter where they come from. So there has to be clarity about this issue if we want to be able to speak again to the very voters who moved to the right. The second point that I want to make is on the issue of leadership and language. In Italy, for a brief period, the Democratic Party appeared to have found an effective leader in Renzi, only to discover that he had many more flaws than virtues, and that essentially he was implementing the program of the right. I remember also another leader who disappointed greatly, meaning Tsipras, a few years ago. LIVRE Uguali, the splinter group that came out of the Partito Democratico, made, among other mistakes, a terrible choice of leader by choosing a politician who, was a former prosecutor who has been, however, an establishment figure for the past a few years. So I think that a visible and populist or popular leader is necessary in an era in which politics is greatly simplified by populism, hegemonic hold on public opinion. The left needs to address ordinary voters with an effective language, and this means also to be able to mobilize the feelings of people and not just their interest. In continental Europe, the left could try to learn something from Corbyn's Labour Party, even though the continental European left has an intrinsic problem, meaning it tends to fragment and divide from the very beginning, right? It's like, I hated the expression, the genetic, the DNA of the left, but that's pretty much what I think it is the problem. However, this is really not a moment for division if the left wants to survive at all in the next European Parliament and have some chances of influencing politics at that level, because fighting racism will depend also on that. Not only on that, but also on that. Thank you.
Okay, so now it's Rui Tavares is a Portuguese politician and former member of the European Parliament. He's also an essayist, writer, and historian. He was elected in 2009 for the left bloc. He then created in 2013 the new party LIVRE. He established several books, among which The Irony of the European Project and Left and Right, a historical guide for the 21st century. He's a former legislator for the European Parliament. In particular, he focused on refugee and fundamental rights issues. He got a doctorate in history at the École des études sociales in Paris, and he's currently a visiting professor at Brown University.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Etienne and Silvana, for your very interesting interventions that I think will provide a lively debate afterwards. The other day I cracked open Voltaire's Le siècle de Louis XIV, the century of Louis XIV. It's a big volume of maybe 800, 1,000 pages, but in the very first paragraph it says that Europe could be considered already for a long time as a big republic shared by many states, une grande république partagée par plusieurs États, which is a striking sentence for one to read, because of course I've been in the last couple of decades listening the whole time that Europe cannot be a federation, a democracy, a republic, and I've been engaging in many discussions such as this as how to create this European republic or democracy or federation. And here I am reading a book from the first half of the 18th century where Voltaire is saying, not as a controversial statement, but as a matter-of-fact statement, that Europe is already a big republic, une grande république. He says, il y avait déjà longtemps, so already a long time ago, that we could consider Europe as a big republic shared by many states. And then he goes on to say that some of these states are monarchies, some of these states are republics in themselves, some of these states are mixed or aristocratic or whatever, but there is a certain set of rights that defines the jurisdictional space of Europe as a kind of a material constitution. And along these rights he mentions, for instance, well, they do not seem like, huge civil rights to us today, but for instance, in Europe, ambassadors are not killed. It's one of the first things that he says that kind of defines the European political space. Right to travel, right to trade, and then he says that when one power in Europe starts being too hegemonic, the other powers will gang up to try and bring this power, this about to be hegemonic power, down to earth again. And then he proceeds to explain what happened with the War of Spanish Succession and the Peace of Utrecht, and how it happened that many powers in Europe, England, the Netherlands, Portugal, Austria, tried to bring Louis XIV back to earth and to avoid him accumulating the throne of France with the throne of Spain. So, how is it so that he was already speaking about Europe as a republic? Maybe a possible explanation is that what we call a republic, a democracy, a federation depends very much on what we, as a community, collectively decide to call a republic, a democracy, or a federation. I've seen many discussions before and after the Brexit referendum about how the EU is undemocratic from the British point of view. And then you can show, a table where you have how the EU politically functions and how the United Kingdom politically functions, and it's not all that different from the institutional point of view. It is not all that different, the system of the EU and the system of the UK. The EU does not have the House of Lords, so chalk that one for the EU. But in other aspects, maybe it's less democratic, but it is quite obvious that for us, both in the UK and in the rest of the EU, we have decided that the UK is indeed a democracy and the EU is not. So it is not only the institutional level that has to interest us when thinking about how to radically democratize the European Union, which is my main topic. Not even the para-institutional level, the level of parties and how do they work, but the societal or cultural level that we have to work on if we want to have European democracy as a goal, which I think we should have. Because, let me make a bold statement here that I will defend later on in the debate part, I don't think that the European Union is going away. I don't think it will neither fragmentate nor collapse. And even bolder, I think that the far right in the European Union today is going to be a driver of European politics. They will, La Lega and Salvini will do to Europe what he did to Italy. First he was from Lega Nord, the Northerners first, now is for Italy, the Italians first, and then because precisely of the reasons that Silvana is saying, they have more interest in keeping the European Union and taking it from within than making it collapse. So, as if I'm right about this, if the European Union is not to collapse or going away, we have to think about how to do with it. And the main three planks that I would suggest for not the creation of a European democracy, but for the ongoing fight for a European democracy that would be the commitment of many millions of European democrats will be, well, on the one hand, you have institutional change. And there is some institutional change that we do need. Some of this institutional change is very technical. For instance, we will need to abolish Article 51 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the US, 50 beautiful, wonderful articles that give us the most up-to-date list of rights today, but then Article 51 says that these articles are not applicable in the internal order of the member states. So we are in a kind of a US antebellum situation regarding the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is a wonderful document, 10 wonderful amendments, but then in the internal order of the Federated States you have slavery. That's not quite the case in terms of content, but the homology is there. You have 50 articles that apply to the institutional level of the Union, but no Hungarian citizen, for instance, can take the Hungarian government to court and says Article 16, 20, and 21 of my rights are being violated by my government. And since we have not outsourced this work of defending the writers to the Hungarian citizen, we end up with this system where it is the European institutions that have to do what the Hungarian citizen will do better than the European institutions. And of course they are afraid to do it because they do not have the legitimacy of the Hungarian citizen. So this is one change that I will do. Very technical, very hard to explain. I don't know how to mobilize millions of people for, I don't see millions of people in the street saying abolish Article 51 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So important change, but difficult to make it an object of political desire in terms of the society. We can and must change the European parties in order, because now we have European parties that have lots of power, but that do not behave as parties in the national level. So politicians from the European People's Party or from the Party of European Socialists, they meet every month. They arrange for appointments, they decide, they negotiate policies, but nobody ever sees the logo or the symbol or the name of the EPP or of the Socialist European Party in the ballot. This would be an important para-institutional change. But I think that in order to move rapidly to the tail of this argument, which is where I think where we can do most of the fight for a European democracy, I think that what we have to change is mostly not at the institutional or para-institutional level, is, as I said in the beginning, at the societal or cultural level. What we need objects of political desire in Europe. In the United States or in Brazil, for instance, two examples of countries of more or less the same size as the European Union, where progressives have suffered huge setbacks in the last years in the form of Donald Trump winning the elections or Dilma Rousseff being impeached by the Brazilian Congress. Brazilian progressives or United States progressives, they keep on fighting because they assume that the political form that inside which they are fighting, which is the Republic of Brazil or the United States of America, will still be there in 10 or 20 or 30 years. They fight for agrarian reform in Brazil, for national health care in the United States. Europe needs these kind of fights for an European social security or for an European minimum wage. Many people will say it does not fit well in the treaties. But it does not work that way. First, you have to have objects of political desire. You have to mobilize people for the kind of everyday bread-winning issues that Silvana was talking about. And when you have created the movement to achieve these goals, then afterwards you have the movement that has achieved the victory and that remains there. Intellectuals usually think about political movements as let's create a movement and then decide on our goal. Historically, it's not like that. First, we have to get votes for women. We have an object of political desire. Then we create the movement to achieve it. And then after we have a political victory, the movement is there ready for another fight. So we need objects of political desire at the European level, or to use a more technical term, we need a list of European public goods that we want to achieve, and then work to achieve it. We could achieve it via a kind of a democratic pact, which would be a new Ventotene manifesto, simple, pragmatic, where people could sign up to at the individual level, or as associations, or as political parties, or maybe we should have a charter. And this will be my last proposal. I think that we need a Chartist strategy for the EU. And I'm sorry that I couldn't be here yesterday for the Charter 77 debate. But let's go to 19th century Chartists in the UK. They had a very simple list of demands. These demands mobilized individual citizens, political parties, trade unions, political clubs, different forms and organizations. People signed up to these goals and they fought for them, but this didn't preclude them being politicians of a party or being trade unionists, etc. So it kind of counteracted, or it acted as a kind of, an antidote to the cannibalistic tendencies of the left. So what if we create a Charter 2020 for the European Union? We can say to socialists, greens, leftists, liberal progressives, whomever wants to sign, that here are the 20 things that we think must be guaranteed in Europe during the next decade. And then we launch this, and people will sign up to the charter and go back to their own lives, and sometimes go back to the movement and fight for these topics. To end up in the original Charter 77, there is something that is very modern in a sense. They say, what is Charter 77? Not a political party, it is not a political party, it is not an organization, it is not an association, it is a loose network of people who want to make sure that the commitments that were signed by the Eastern and the Western Bloc in Helsinki, that the Helsinki agreements will be applied. So it's a little bit like Article 51, the Helsinki agreements were dry and technical documents, they were treaties. But these people acted as an interface between the arid technocratic document and individuals. And they used, in the pre-internet era, they used this word loose network that nowadays we use lots of times. So my proposal will be to use the inspiration of Charter 77. I think that you're on the good way on that, but also of the British Chartist movement of the 19th century, and create a progressive charter for the European Union for today. Thank you.
Okay, so we open the first round of discussion and questions, critiques, critical points to you, also from the other speakers, of course, also among you. So if anyone has a question already, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Yuri. I'm a master's student at the European Institute. Hi, I'm Yuri. I'm a master's student at the European Institute. And it's interesting that Professor Patriarca brought up Cyprus as a trade because I think for a moment Syria amongst its sister countries, Fordham for a new version of Europe. And so I apologize if this is a bit broad, but I
So actually, I have to say, I discovered the existence of this movement only very recently. So I think it's, it's certainly a good idea. Anything that can actually relaunch some kind of debate, in a situation in which we are all very sort of pessimistic, disillusioned, disappointed, and so on, is a good idea. But again, maybe someone else can address that. Who knows better this organization could actually address that, because again I looked at it. I looked at their website. So again, if you have a website, I guess you exist, but maybe not. So you always to be a bit
There's also Vox, by the way, the other one.
Yeah.
Do you, Rui?
Well, maybe Vox was actually almost born here, in this room, more or less, because there was a debate here, and then there were some people that wanted to create a party that would make of the European youth a constituency in itself, that could demand of politicians and parties attention. And in that sense, if you want to do constituency building at the level of the European youth, it's even better to have a party than to have a movement, because parties understand the language of electoral competition, and the movements they can more or less disregard. The M25 has an electoral wing and a kind of a political movement wing, more or less in the sense that I was describing. And now it has moved to create a political movement where my party, LIVRE, is also one of the founding members, called the European Spring, with alternative ads from Denmark, etc. But it is still, I think it's a worthwhile initiative, but in a sense, although it tries to solve Europe's problems, it tries to solve Europe's problems by, maybe perversely, but it is a collateral consequence, adding up to the problems of the left that Silvana was referring to. It's one more party, more competition between the left, Varoufakis and Tsipras, and the kind of tribalism that you have in the left. That's why I keep referring to this idea of the charter, because the charter could kind of occupy the empty spaces between these different political initiatives, where you will have competition and you will have tribalism, because that's part of their nature. What you need to do is to kind of use that competition and tribalism in favor of political goals that should be shared by all the progressives.
Yeah, that's definitely a Machiavellian lesson. We should try to, we should aim at this, try to find some kind of connection among all of the different parts of the left which are a bit dispersed. Etienne, you want to say anything? Other questions?
I have a very direct question for Silvana. I was intrigued by your list of points to reconstitute the left. So I was wondering whether your insights apply specifically to the Italian case or have a broader European ambition, and whether your idea of not trying to chase the populists on their own terrain makes sense actually in the context of Italy. I know that you know the context of Pisa. Pisa was a city that was governed for decades by the left, and now it's governed by the right-wing coalition. So
Yeah.
I was wondering whether this idea of what is left of the left, basically, whether it makes sense to try to reconstitute something that seems to be completely affected by this cannibalistic tendency of chasing a new leader, creating a new leader, and being more populist than the populists themselves.
Yeah. So I was thinking when I made my remarks, I was thinking I had the situation, the disastrous Italian situation in mind primarily. I'm sure that, then I contrasted it with the situation of Britain, where there is a Labour Party, which, it's been dominated by centrists for a while, but now the left has regained control. So, we're hoping that it will do well in the elections and all that. But I think that generally the left is in trouble elsewhere too. I mean, if we think about France, the Socialist Party has really gone down enormously. The German Social Democrats are also in trouble. I mean, this is pretty much a general thing. So I think it's probably not just an Italian issue. So the left must rethink the way it talks to people, right? And then well, in Italy there is something more, which is also, and I believe it's also an element elsewhere, which is a rejection of the establishment. I mean, in general, right? I mean, if you talk anything that has to do with right established parties, doesn't work. So you really have to, you know, there is a lot. You know, it's a very difficult situation, very difficult. But the only way, if they are hegemonizing the political field now, the political space. I guess that you have to learn some of their techniques, or otherwise it's just going to be, you know, going to go. And I don't know, I don't want to live in a society in which I don't even have, you know, anything left of the left. I mean, I still believe that the division makes sense. I mean, that there are, you know, elements in which I recognize myself that I describe as leftist. I mean, certain beliefs in inequality, solidarity, etc. Those are the left, and so everybody is telling me there is no longer any need for this kind of distinction. I don't believe it at all. I don't think we should give up, because we had, again, other moments in history which have been very bad, and if we just give up, I mean, it's our history. The history of the left is a history of defeats, but we have to keep fighting. But you need to find, again, you need to find some kind of common, something in common that also, you also have to recognize the danger of the moment. And this is what, for example, in Pisa, they did not recognize, right? So they were just fighting among you know, they didn't like the Democratic Party in power. I talked to very intelligent people who were saying, no, we're not going to vote for these people, even in the ballottaggio, in the second turn of the elections. And the result is that they have a Northern League mayor. Great result. Thank you.
So I need to be brief and therefore take no precautions and jump into the question of the left is crucial. I think it's crucial for many of us, because this is where we come from, this is where our ideals have been built, and the way we believe to understand social and political matters, the material constitution I was alluding to, all that, of course, comes from leftist tradition. On the other hand, those of us who are a little older, like me, and also, of course, the younger people, they know that the left is never unified per se, that it's a permanent site of conflicts. Now, these conflicts are more or less acute, and they are more or less dangerous. My conviction is that in this moment, the question is not just to unify the left or find a good strategy or a good program, if you like, or a good. I find everything you said wonderful. I agree completely with that. To define European public goods, to try and create something like a Chartist movement. But, in fact, what I believe the question is to recreate the left and not just to reunite the left at a transnational level. And recreate means that certain basic contradictions are not only exposed, but they are fought in civil terms with absolutely no compromise. So there are points where you have to be on one side or you have to be on the other side. And so you're not sure that you're right, but you must choose. So, for example, my old friend Chantal Mouffe is on one side and on the other side, because she believes that something like the left populism makes sense. Not only I don't believe that, but I believe it's extremely dangerous. So, but it's not enough to say it. So one of the most interesting, in a sense, political initiatives that are taking form in this moment in Europe, and it's widely reported, etc., is in Germany. it's Sarah Wagenknecht's proposal to create a kind of supra-partisan alliance that gathers people in order, that's what she claims, and you should not reject that at face value, to regain the support of popular classes, especially in the working class, especially in the East, that is, where in fact the unification of Germany has produced a worse effect of social disruption, etc., and not let them be forever and progressively enrolled in a more and more massive and active manner in a neo-fascist movement, because it's nothing other than that. And that involves, of course, a big question: how far do you go in adopting positions that are, in fact, indiscernible from the positions that the far right has adopted, even if after that you start explaining that you have to be cautious on immigration in particular, but not only. So I believe that this is, and I take this very seriously, because when you look at the people who have gathered around Wagenknecht's project, there are very remarkable people there. There are very remarkable people there. Our main economic and social advisor is Wolfgang Strick. Many of us have read Strick and have been impressed by the way in which he describes some of the roots of the Euro crisis, and taught us something from, I would say, a post-Marxist point of view on the transformations of nation states under the impact of financial domination of financial market. So this is to be. I don't see even something as solid as that, in a sense, on the other side. And that's why I'm so worried. But I believe that this should be, that we can make no compromise with that position, so that I know that will lead me at some point to become, hopefully not to fight with, to kick each other, but to be totally opposed to the positions that are advocated. I mentioned you, could mention others. The situation of Mélenchon is particularly interesting in France. He's courted on many sides, and he doesn't even know himself very well where he will go in the end. Because in a sense, viscerally, Mélenchon is a nationalist. This is absolutely visceral in his case. But on the other hand, the problem for him is also to gather a movement on the French left that is strong enough to compete with Macron, with neoliberalism. And this, at this moment, let's cross our fingers, is not to be done or made on a purely, particularly on anti-migrancy position. So this is floating. So because I've spoken too much, I must conclude. I think that, of course, there are matters of principle which are involved here. The question of the left is not. It is a question of objects of political desire, but among these objects are, of course, moral or universal values. That's something important, but that will not suffice, and that will not suffice. So therefore, we need to demonstrate and convince people in particular that to resist austerity policies and neoliberal policies in Europe is not something that you can succeed to do at a purely national level. That a nationalist program in this respect will not do. But that's not simple, because everything at the European federal or quasi-federal level, in this moment, including, of course, the euro currency, works in the opposite direction. So to say that we would need something like a Corbyn style or policy that would not be purely British, if you like, but that would somehow become a kind of pan-European inspiration, perhaps with the help of Corbyn himself, because this history is not finished, is the kind of, I would say, wishful thinking, or we've already dropped many names like that, etc. But that's where I would try and go personally.
Thanks, Etienne. I have one more question, and we have, okay, 2 more questions. 3? Okay, so let's collect the 3 questions. You can please be short and then like answer really quickly. Then.
Okay, so I attended the economist conference a few weeks ago where Steve Bannon spoke right before David Miliband. And they asked both of these participants about inequality and how we solve it. Steve Bannon said decrease free trade, decrease immigration. David Miliband said give tax subsidies to the middle class and raise the minimum wage. Obviously, I am one to support Bannon's position, but if I look at it clearly, it is a short-term position just as Bannon's is. Because today, inequality is not driven by differences in wages, but differences between capital gains and wage growth. What do you think are the prospects for having a unified capital gains tax in Europe, which would be a necessary thing to do if you wouldn't want capital to escape your country? And it could also become a model for maybe something to do on a grander scale with other institutions as well.
I'm not sure I completely understand the word, but just to have a what?
A unified policy around taxes on wealth in Europe.
The second question there, please. Yeah.
Yes. Your last remarks kind of worry. I mean, I don't want to take history too serious, but something serious has to be learned from that. And when the left try to be too much right or try to copy too much right, we have historical, examples about what happened. I mean, you have in France the Sorelians, radical left that became associated with the Maurasians, and in Italy, what can we get? I mean, there's the revolutionary syndicalists, Mussolini probably was one of them too, when associated with the right. I am not taking that, I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen, but words, it kind of works, yeah.
There's a tendency.
Music kind of,
Thank you. And the last question?
Yes. So today we speak a lot about recreating the left, thinking about a charter writing for the left. I think that presumes a lot of commonalities exist between the left across north and south, west and east in Europe. So my question is actually, what are these type of issues that we can find coming around across the scattered left in Europe? And do we even share a common viewpoint on that? So making that to migration, even if we all on the left think that that's an important topic, can we actually find commonalities across what we name the left here?
Okay, this is the last question. I think will also be answered in the second session. I can give you like 4 minutes total to answer.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay, so I let's start with the left question. I think that it always reminds me of the joke of the person who goes to the doctor and says, when I touch here it hurts, when I touch here it hurts, when I touch my knee it hurts, when I touch my foot it hurts. And then the doctor says, well, your finger is broken. Because the thing is that we are always trying to find the explanation, because we have this kind of analytical, genealogical mode of thinking in the left. We need to know why did the national populists, the fascists and the ethno-nationalists appeared. So in Europe, everybody will say, well, the European Union was too neoliberal and too undemocratic. It created the Farages and the Salvinis and the Orbans. But here, people say, well, it was Obama and Hillary. But you go to Brazil, and people will complain not of having had a centrist president that sold the values of the left and worked with the center-right. People will say it's because Lula is a crypto-communist. He wanted to turn Brazil into a Venezuela. That's why we have Bolsonaro now with 30% in Brazil. So the fascists appear for different reasons in the Netherlands. But people will say it was the crisis. Well, we had Berlusconi in Italy before the crisis. And we had, what was the guy's name? Well, in the Dutch guy, Fortuyn in the Netherlands way before the crisis. So it does not have, either it does not have a single explanation, because we have powerful fascist movements in countries that are still very equal, that have still social welfare states that are in good shape, like in Sweden, and of course in very unequal countries. So either it is different explanations for different fascisms in different countries, or maybe we just have to get round to the reality that there is an ethno-nationalistic thinking in society, and that a part of society has nationalistic ethnic ideas. And once we kind of realize that there is no necessary deterministic genealogy between a change in material conditions, it can be exacerbated, of course, if you have more unemployment than the rest. But maybe the sociological lesson that we took from the 30s, which is crisis, unemployment, fascism, maybe it does not necessarily apply today. If we get that out of the way, then we realize that, and in here I'm more in agreement with Etienne than with Silvana, that maybe the idea of the left running before what the far right is saying and kind of trying to go middle way, like you guys don't want any immigrants. And we, on the other hand, we will recognize that immigration is a problem. I think it is a trap for the left. It is a trap for the left, because if we do that, we make nobody happy. We will never make the people who want to be fascists happy, and we will completely abandon lots of people, particularly in the youth, who want someone to defend what for them is already a way of life, which is a borderless way of life. So this is, and just only one thing on the European tax. I think that's completely one of the things that should unite us. And when you speak in political debates, the one thing that everybody is in agreement is that lots of companies and rich people do not pay taxes. You should have a common corporate tax base in Europe, and you should have a kind of a federal tax in Europe. It is an object of political desire that people are willing to fight for, and of course it should serve as a blueprint against tax evasion at the global level. In Europe, we lose every year 1 trillion euros. That's more than the budget of the European for 7 years. The whole budget. So there is money, and then you can deliver lots of public goods with that money. But you have to go get that money. I think that's something that could mobilize people.
Thanks.
Can I just say one word? Actually, when I talked about recognizing the fears of people, I was not talking about just having a program that addresses migration with the terms of of the right. I'm just saying that there's some kind of need to, because these fears are stirred and they become really toxic when there is also an economic situation that is bad, that is problematic and so on. You have to address that issue of the economy first, and then to be able to actually then have some kind of credibility to address the rest. And also, when I talk about being populist, I'm not talking about again adhering to a program made on the right. I'm just talking about the way you actually speak to the people. I mean, much more a question of communication, of language, of style than anything else substantial. But it has to be again, because the terms are are now defined by the right. You just have to make sure that you have a way of talking that speaks to people and not just to the believers. That's all.
Okay, thank you all. I should invite the other speakers to come. So we're now going to open the second session on migration. It's going to be Andreas Kalyvas to open this session. Andreas is Associate Professor of Political Science at the New School for Social Research. He works on democratic theory and the history of political ideas from ancient Greek up to contemporary issues. His current research is oriented towards both questions of constituent power and radical democratic politics, and also dictatorship and tyranny. He co-authored Liberal Beginnings, Making a Republic for the Moderns, and is currently completing a book manuscript titled Constituent Power and Radical Democracy. Please, Andreas.
So thank you for the invitation, and let's see how these very brief thoughts will relate to the previous discussion. So I start from the assumption, or rather the observation, that the question of migration today is absolutely crucial to accurately grasp the nature of the current political situation in Europe. This is my assumption, this is my observation. The critical importance of migration is evident in the ongoing reconfiguration of the European political map and the impasses and dilemmas that presently confront the European Union, sometimes called crisis, and its unification project. The rise of far-right, I will not call populism, I think populism is the wrong term, that embellishes the enemy one is confronted with. The enemy is the far-right, it's not populism. The decline and instability of the political center, the nationalism and authoritarianism that threatens to fracture and fragment the European project are all phenomena directly related to the question of migration. I don't mean to say by that that migration is the only factor, but it's certainly a main factor that in the last post-Cold War decades is radically transforming European politics. I will say also that an inability to understand that is what is tormenting the left in the last 30-40 years. There are, of course, other major forces at play, but it seems to me that they are being articulated around and galvanized by migration as the key symbolic signifier that is shaping the multiple and diverse struggles of the present. So, migration has become a master political signifier in Europe today, and it makes sense to paraphrase the famous quote from the Communist Manifesto: a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of migration. But also, a spectre is also haunting the European left, the spectre of migration, although no spectre of migration is haunting the right and the far right. And this has to tell us something. If this is the case, as I think it is, it follows that migration is the great fault line of European politics, and in fact it has already established the new front lines where the most important battles are waged and the future of Europe will be eventually decided. So it's the central fight, but of course it's not the only one. In fact, migration has transformed already the politics of borders, both literally and metaphorically. Borders have become a privileged site of political contestation and a space of new political subjectivities in the making. This is something that the right has understood, the left is still waiting to wake up to understand it. For instance, in the summer and fall of 2015, this is just an example of the new sides of political struggle, that they have a privileged political significance today, something remarkable happened in the long history of the European interstate system. I think for the first time, confrontations of a new kind took place on borders. On the borders of Greece and Macedonia, Hungary and Serbia, France and England, to mention a few ones, border police and national armies clashed with asylum seekers and irregular migrants, bullets were fired, protests and demonstrations were organized, fences were brought down. The same several months later, across the United States, I'm not going to go there here because it's about Europe, but it's interesting to note some similarities. In the United States, airports, internal borders, became politicized from below by thousands of demonstrators protesting against the Trump government's travel ban. Now, the novelty of such occurrences points to the new form of political struggles, the emergence of new political space of intervention and direct participation, and the elements of a different vision of Europe that can be truly post-national, internationalist, anti-fascist, and many other things, like anti-capitalist as well. It is not, however, a coincidence that the far right sought to intervene on the ground during the summer and the fall of 2015, violently to repress and crush this plebeian mobilization of politicization of mobility. It sent shock troopers to repress the migrants and the refugees. What needs to be reminded, however, is that it was one of the few instances that it was the far right was overtaken by the events, by those events, and had to react to a political dynamic that developed from the politicized and self-organized tactics of the migrants themselves. Now, what followed since then is well known in Europe. It was discussed in Italy, but not only. Now, what is less commented, though, and needs to be emphasized and interpreted and dealt with, is the absence of the institutional left from these struggles. Instead of taking sides with the migrants and the refugees, join them against the far right and the state apparatuses of border control, aligned together around common interests and principles, the European left remained silent, passive, embarrassed, and disoriented. And a little bit humanitarian. Like I think, like Silvana mentioned, these people need help, we should help them. This is not a political position, this is a position of defeat. In fact, this has been the situation with the European left for a very long time, avoiding to take any position regarding the question of migration unless it is to mimic badly the positions of the far right, called populism, in the name of not alienating its voters. So if the voters in a nation state are racist, let's accept that they are racist, let's not alienate them. If they are nationalists, let's play in the field of nationalism. I think this is the wrong attitude and it has been proven wrong, because if that was correct, and if the general, let's say, opinion is about, let's say, pro-capitalist, then the left should have benefited by becoming neoliberal, but in fact it didn't benefit by playing on the ground of neoliberals. Why it will benefit now, playing into the ground of xenophobia, racism, anti-migration. And yet, this lack of engagement, turning a blind eye, has contributed to the decline of the left. To an important degree, this decline of the institutional left in Europe, call it social democratic or any other name you want to give it, is due to its inability to take up the question of migration and turn it into its central political objective. It seems to me that the disarray of the European left in these long 30-40 years is partly caused by its inadequate response to migration and to the manifold political issues it brings into the fore, such as nationalism, labor relations, questions of border, exclusion, citizenship, global capitalism. So to conclude very briefly, the future of Europe and the future of the left are deeply intertwined to the degree that if there is a real possibility, a historical change to renew the emancipatory project of the old continent, it will predominantly depend on the question of migration, and it will play out on the terrain of migration. And that is what the right very well knows. Could the left decide to unify anti-capitalist and anti-austerity struggles with pro-migrant and pro-refugee demands by creating a coalition between domestic and transnational labor against domestic and transnational capitalist oligarchies, within the context of a new European vision beyond the nation state, federalism, for instance, and its antiquated techno-capitalist institutions, a new radical internationalism may emerge to defeat the far right and its neoliberal authoritarian nationalism. The current situation demands, and I think it cries for, the radicalization of the left on the terrain of migration. To put it very bluntly, I'm convinced that in the present political conjuncture, the more radical and extreme and partisan and confrontational the left becomes when it comes to migration and capitalism, the more likely Europe to be saved as a democratic space of emancipation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andreas. Okay, Carlo Invernizzi. He's assistant professor of political theory at the City College of New York and associate researcher at the Center for European Studies on the Institut d'études politiques in Paris. He holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University, a master's degree from the Institut d'études politiques, and a bachelor's degree from Oxford University. His research combines a historical approach to the study of political ideas with a concern for contemporary normative issues. He's the author of Relativism and Religion, Why Democratic Societies Do Not Need Moral Absolutes, and he's also contributing to as a commentator for venues such as Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, La Repubblica, Le Monde Diplomatique, etc. Please.
Yes, thank you very much. So, what I would like to talk about today very much follows from what Andreas was talking about, but maybe from the, not from the opposite normative perspective, but looking at the issue from the opposite angle. And what I want to ask is, why is it that the left, the institutional left, the electoral left, has failed to articulate a positive position on the question of immigration? A positive position, I mean, not just a replica of the right position, but a bit less. Why is it that the right owns this issue? Owns it in the sense that empirical evidence shows that the more the issue of immigration gains in salience, the more the left goes down. So if we talk about immigration, we lose. Why is that? And the way I want to address this question is by looking at some of the arguments in the spirit of an agora. Looking at some of the arguments that the left has been trying to make on immigration, and thinking about why they have failed to persuade. So I'm going to be thinking critically about why we've failed. What is it about the positions we have tried to stake out which doesn't work? Because clearly something has been going wrong. These are the arguments I want to criticize in many ways my arguments, the arguments I believe, the arguments of the left. But what's wrong with it? Why are we failing so badly on immigration? I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to go briefly through 3 arguments. One that is not articulated explicitly very often, although we have people who do, and we should be praised for that, but always somehow in the background of a left-wing attempt at articulating a distinctive position on immigration, is what I would call maybe an argument for the open society, or the idea that multiculturalism, which at core I think is some kind of belief that difference, diversity, mixity is not just a fact, it's a value. We like it. We like a society where there are many different people is a good society because that's how cultures grow, there's intermixture. That seems to me like an idea that's not spelled out very often, but is always in the background of the left when it thinks about immigration. Surely diversity is a good thing. And it seems to me, as I say, I share that idea. Of course I'm for the open society, but I don't know if you've ever had the experience of trying to articulate that view to somebody who doesn't share that view. Somebody who actually likes homogeneity, or somebody who likes stability, who doesn't like change, who likes protection. It completely falls flat. The persuasive power of articulating the ideal of an open society seems to be very low. Why? Why is it? Well, it seems to me that one reason at least is that it's actually not an argument, but just an assertion of a taste or an assertion of a value I have. And there, in many ways, begs the key question of if you like, what we have to prove is that the open society is good. Just saying we are for the open society begs the key question. It seems to be an assertion of taste, and somebody who has a different taste, who likes stability, likes homogeneity, will just not be persuaded by these Obama-like descriptions of a multicultural, happy society. So, a second argument that's often made, and Andreas mentioned it, in fact this is the one that's made much more often explicitly, seems to me the moral argument, the humanitarian argument. That's the argument that the left, especially the Christian left, makes much more often. And this is the idea that we have a duty to accept immigrants, not because we like an open society, but because they are in need. There is an idea that immigrants are victims of war, famine, poverty, and it is because they are victims that we should take them in. We have a moral duty to help those in need. This seems to be a very common argument made to defend immigration. When the left tries, it tries in that way. And I agree with Andreas, this is also a weak argument for several reasons. The first one is that actually, empirically, it's not so true. I hate to say it, but it's not so true that the ones who come are the ones who are most in need. Very often, it's actually very expensive to migrate to Europe. And most migrants who come don't come in the most desperate ways, like on a boat through the Mediterranean. In Italy, for instance, the vast majority of immigrants come with an airplane and then overstay their visa. These are not the most desperate people. So empirically, the argument has little traction, but more importantly, it seems to me that the problem with a moral argument for why we need to take immigrants is also that we ought to help people in need is true, but I don't only have intuitive opinion if I'm not in need myself. When I feel that I am in need and I have a difficult situation, then of course I don't, if I am a victim, I don't need to help the victim. So anybody who feels that they're somehow wronged by our society says, I don't need to help others, people need to help me. So this race to being a victim that the logic of humanitarianism institutes goes not very far in trying to persuade people to see immigration as something positive. So that argument I also find weak. The third argument I'll briefly consider is the one I personally find most persuasive, but remember I'm trying to see what's wrong with these, is what I call, so the first one was maybe the aesthetic argument, the open society, the second one was the moral one. Here's the economic argument for migration, which is the argument Merkel tried to make in that fateful summer of 2015, when for a moment she tried to stake out a different position on immigration. And the idea is we need migrants. Migrants are good for us. Migrants, we are an aging population. We need the kind of labor that they can bring. We're an aging and shrinking population. So this seems to me a persuasive or a powerful argument to make, is that actually it's not a problem but a resource. But why does that fail to persuade too? Merkel was, as everyone knows, shot down. And that argument has completely died. Nobody makes it anymore. If you make that argument, you die politically here now. Why is that? Well, this gets to a point which seems to me interesting, and then will lead me to the conclusion of what could be actually a more stronger version of that argument, which is the reason it fails is also related to the broader problem of the debate about globalization in general. It's an argument about aggregate benefits. Germany as a whole, Italy as a whole benefits from immigration, which completely ignores the distributional question of the effects of immigration. And the effects of immigration are not equally distributed amongst the population. There are some people who gain and some people who lose, even if at the aggregate level we all gain. We cannot fail to confront the fact that if you are low-skilled workers and more low-skilled workers come in the country, it is a problem for you. It's increased competition. So even though Germany as a whole might gain, there are people who don't gain from immigration. There are losers of globalization, as the famous sentence goes. And it seems to me it's precisely those losers of globalization who don't like immigration and things like that. And this leads me to what would be my conclusion, to how can we, reflecting on these weaknesses, the weakness of the aesthetic argument, the weakness of the moral argument, and the problem with the economic one, can we think of a more powerful version of an argument that the left could take up to defend immigration? It would have to address that problem of the distributional consequences of immigration. So, and the argument seems to be this, it's to say, well, if it is true that there are aggregate benefits for everybody, which are unequally distributed, then clearly the only way in which the left can take up and stake up a positive position on immigration, if it takes that into account and therefore redistributes the benefits that come from immigration, that come from globalization, in the interest of all. Which is another way of saying, and with this I conclude, that what is the problem with the arguments that the left has been making about immigration, at least I go in the sense of there. All the three arguments I made are basically liberal arguments. They are arguments about, we like diversity, what about human rights, and it's in the economic interest of all. If the left is just liberal and divorced from a social component, as a component of redistribution of the benefits of migration and globalization, it will fail. It fails to convince the losers of globalization that are its constituency. So unless the left ties the issue of migration to a broader social redistributive project, it cannot, it will continue to fail as it has. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo. So Davide Ragazzoni is a PhD candidate in political theory at Columbia University, where he's writing a dissertation titled Partisanship Before Parties, Taking Sides in Pre-Party Politics. At Columbia, he also completed a special minor in law. He was trained in the history of political philosophy at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa in Italy, and among many other essays and books, he co-authored with Nadia La Vera Seconda Repubblica, published in 2016. Please.
Thank you so much, Caterina. When Caterina asked me to decide which of the two themes of the panel I wanted to talk about, whether Europe or migration, I had a hard time deciding, because in my view, the two topics, as we learned from the speakers before, are intimately connected. And I eventually decided to talk very briefly about the topic of migrations, because I think that is a topic that we can all relate to very, very deeply. So it is a theme that I feel that I care very much about as someone who left Italy, where I was born and grew up, to pursue academic opportunities elsewhere. But it's also one of the words that in the contemporary landscape I think best describes who we are, not simply as Europeans, but also as human beings. Many of us in the room, if not the vast majority, probably have experienced migration to some extent throughout their life. We are in a very privileged situation among scholars who can travel and cross borders very frequently, almost on a monthly basis, to go to conferences and come back. But we also are aware, very much aware, that this is not the case for everyone. And so the term migrations has different connotations that it's important to keep in mind. As Carlo reminded us, there are different sources of migrations, different sorts of migrations, and recalling the different kinds of factors that push us or pull us away is a beneficial exercise. Now, as a political theorist, I strongly believe that it's important to always engage with what happens in the real world in order to be able to better theorize the phenomena that we want to study. And I would like to focus in these 5 minutes on an event that you probably read about in the news throughout August, which is what happened on board of the Italian Coast Guard ship Diciotti. I will very briefly summarize the event for those of you who are not aware of it, and then try to draw some conclusions that I think matter for the kind of debate that we are having here tonight. So around August 20th, an Italian Coast Guard ship named Ubaldo Diciotti with 177 migrants on board, mostly from Eritrea and Somalia, remained docked in Catania, Sicily, for 5 days, with Italy's Interior Minister, the leader of the Northern League, Matteo Salvini, refusing authorization for the refugees and migrants to disembark. The passengers, he said, would not be allowed on land until Europe steps in to help. After 3 days of negotiations, Italy's transportation minister, MP for Five Star Movement Danilo Toninelli, confirmed that the Diciotti ship would dock in Catania. On national TV, Salvini replied and rejected this statement. He said the ship may land in Italy as long as the almost 180 migrants are distributed in a spirit of solidarity across the EU. And he also threatened to send migrants back to Libya if other European countries did not share the burden of hospitality. Now, after almost a week on the ship, 27 migrant children were allowed to disembark eventually at the port of Catania, while Salvini refused to let the other 150 migrants on board off the vessel, and explicitly challenged, which is revealing, the Italian Prime Minister and the President of the Italian Republic to overrule his decision. This, I think, is very revealing of the kind of diarchy that we have actually as government right now in Italy, with two parties that have two opposite visions of the future of the country, and yet decided to stay together, form a temporary contingent alliance, and have a delegate, our current Prime Minister Conte, in order to stay in power. So, long story short, in the end, what happened is that the Italian Catholic Church decided to take 100 migrants, and Ireland and Albania agreed to take 20 each. Now, the recent case of the Diciotti rescue ship, and the reason why I decided to start from this very practical issue, raises an important question, a question that concerns human beings even before concerning humanitarian law. It was a ship filled with women, men, and children running away from a domestic context of despair and the inability to practice even the basic democratic rights that are constitutive of human agency. So it's a kind of migration that actually is not part, we would not be able to reject based on the interesting threefold account that Carlo provided us with. It's actually a matter of migration which sees people that have nothing to lose trying to cross borders. Now, the violation of the basic democratic rights in the country of origins is already enough to regulate the rights and claims of asylum seekers according to Article 10 of the Italian Constitution, and I would like to briefly read this article. Quote unquote, the Italian juridical order conforms to the generally recognized norms of international law. The legal status of foreigners is regulated by law in conformity with international provisions. Liberties guaranteed by the Italian Constitution has the right of asylum in the territory of the Republic in accordance with the conditions established by law. The extradition of a foreigner for political offenses is not tolerable. So those who cross border under these specific conditions and thus engage in a very specific kind of migration are, as I said, desperate. They have literally nothing to lose. They throw themselves literally into the sea, hoping for the best. Even that seems to them a better fate than a hopeless life. Now, law, which is often described in a very condescending way by politicians as a matter of technicalities, procedures, regulations, that prevent politicians to pursue the true national interest, this is the picture that they usually portray, law has at its core the task of protecting human beings. This applies even more when human beings are in open sea, where they are more vulnerable than anywhere else, and where their protection has traditionally been a concern at the international and national level. I'm just recalling the Hamburg Convention of 1979, but also Italy's Code of Navigation from 1942, which has very specific provisions that make it a duty, a legal duty that is punishable through the law when it's not enforced to rescue people that are in distress in open sea. Now, what is usually not mentioned, and I think that this is an interesting point to keep in mind, is that an Italian coast guard ship, as the Diciotti ship was, is already part of Italy's national territory. Which means that on board of the ship, it is a legal duty to abide by the laws of the country to which the ship belongs, even when the ship finds itself in waters that fall under the jurisdiction of another country. The migrants that were rescued by the Italian Coast Guard crossed the borders of Italy, not when Salvini or anyone else decides that them would be allowed to cross the borders of Italy, but on the very moment they were rescued and led on the ship. So they had already entered the national borders of Italy. The decision not to let them off the ship and thus not allow them on land is de facto a decision to block the migrants ad interim within a specific portion of Italy's national territory, in a condition of detention, thus infringing upon their personal freedom guaranteed by Article 13 of the Italian Constitution. Now, if we keep this legalistic picture in mind, and then we try to look at the issue of how to speak to people, I think there is a dichotomy here. Now, one of the reasons why Salvini's very rough and unpleasant rhetoric actually succeed in fueling debate but also resonating widely among Italians is that, in my opinion, just to put it very briefly, it is what we might consider a wrong answer to a really existing problem. What he does in a very debatable way is to draw attention to a major flaw of the European Union, wherein the pursuit of selfish, short-term national interests remains pervasive and eclipses the capacity to envision and pursue long-term shared strategies. One of the most revealing indicators that I always find very funny, if not tragic actually, is that the banknotes of the euro, if we think about it, the currency of the eurozone, show monuments that do not exist in reality. Why is this the case? Because the member states were not able to find an agreement on which monuments they should choose to put and represent on the banknotes of the eurozone, because they were afraid that they would favor one state over the others. So how could you expect, we could say, through Salvini's worldview, that the European Union can envision a common agenda and a common set of policies about migrations when they actually cannot even agree on which monuments they want to represent on the currency? If we stick with the problem of migration, we see the persistence of national selfishness in one of the most important documents that regulates migrations across borders in the EU, the Dublin Regulation of 2013, which determines which EU member state is responsible for examining an application for asylum seekers asking for international protection within the EU under the Geneva Convention. Among the provisions of the 2013 Dublin Regulation, we find that the country in which the asylum seeker first applies for asylum is responsible for either accepting or rejecting the claim, and the seeker may not restart the process in another jurisdiction, precisely to reduce the number of so-called orbiting asylum seekers across the EU. Now, what happens is that most of the times the country in which the asylum seeker first applies for asylum is Italy, with obvious implications for the distribution of asylum seekers across the EU. Last November, the European Parliament, through the group of Socialists and Democrats, agreed actually on the importance to start a discussion about how to replace the specific clause of the Dublin Regulation with a revised mechanism that would allow to handle differently and more fairly a phenomenon that is only meant to grow stronger and stronger over the next years and requires better and foresighted strategies. To do so, it is crucial that the European Union has the braveness and the ambition, and this has been urged by many speakers in the previous section, to become more than an intergovernmental organization and have the courage to turn itself into a political rather than purely economic project. To conclude, all this is crucial, in my opinion, to keep in mind that if we really want to avoid that the term migration becomes a catchword at the mercy of populist leaders around the globe and can retain its constellation of meanings and continues to describe one of the most distinctive expressions of human nature, we really come up with a feasible, viable political project. We are human beings, inter alia, also because we move, and we cannot but stop moving. We have always moved, and we will always keep moving. Now, Horace said back in the days, "Celum non animum mutant, qui trans mare currunt." They changed their sky, not their soul, who rush across the sea. I think that if we look at this maxim through our contemporary eyes, we are able to see and retrieve the complexity of the term migrations beyond what populist leaders try to make about it. Thank you.
So, last but not least, Achille Varzi is a professor here, professor of philosophy at Columbia University. He got his PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto, Canada, and his main research interests are in logic and metaphysics. He's an editor of the Journal of Philosophy, subject editor of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and many other journals, and he also contributes regularly to some Italian newspapers, and is currently teaching for the prison education program sponsored by Columbia University's Just in Education Initiative. Please, Achille.
Thank you. So at this point, I think we have heard more than enough, actually, to open the floor again and continue our conversations. I'm just going to add one thing, which connects to the subtitle of this event, which reads, "The future is at the borders." Because if there is one thing that is often mentioned in meetings such as this, but rarely articulated and rarely questioned, is precisely that thing, borders, the notion of a border, on which so much depends, as actually Andreas already pointed out, and many of the other speakers also said. So let's think about it for a minute. What's so special? What's so special about these things, about borders? What's so special? What was so special in the trench that Romulus was digging, where his city's wall was to run, that made him kill his own brother just for passing that line? What kind of magical power did Jefferson's pencil have, or actually his pencil and his ruler have, when he drew the lines that literally called into being the states of the so-called Northwest Ordinance? How is it possible that the colonial powers of Europe could just meet in Berlin and draw a few lines on a map to split up the entire African continent like a magnificent cake? And the phrase often quoted, but still awfully terrible, is an actual phrase that you probably know used by King Leopold of Belgium at that time. Let's split that cake. So let's think about it. We fill our atlases and our lives with those thin lines to the point of getting our lives over them, defining our identities, our sense of belongingness, our rights and duties, and the rights and duties of others. Why on earth are we endowing those damn thin lines with such incredible power? There was a time when, of course, we thought that there was indeed something magical about, or perhaps something sacred about them. Romulus, for one, dug out the trench because he was convinced that that was the plan or the will of the gods. And that idea has survived actually through the centuries until modern times. Think of the Ancien Régime rhetoric retained in Danton's proclamation in 1793, the year from which Silvana took her starting point. So Danton's proclamation that the borders of France have been marked out by nature with capital N. Or to stick to my own country, think of Giuseppe Mazzini, one of the main figures in the unification of Italy in 1861. He wouldn't hesitate to describe the boundaries of Italy as a present from God. Quote, "The home wherein God has placed us." And here's a longer quotation from a famous piece that he wrote in 1859, so just 2 years before the unification. "To you," he wrote, "to you who were born in Italy, God has allotted the best defined country in Europe. In other lands marked by more uncertain and more interrupted limits, questions may arise. In yours, no. God has stretched round you sublime and indisputable boundaries On the one side, the sea, the immeasurable sea. On the other, the highest mountains of Europe, the Alps. Really? How lucky of me to have been born within those boundaries. And that makes me so special. That makes me different from those who were born on the other side. Just think about it. I wish Mazzini was still alive, actually, because as recently as 2008, so 10 years ago, Italy and Switzerland were still working, sitting at a table, not like this, but roughly like this, still working on a conventional agreement to define the Alpine boundary and determine its exact location. Ice is melting, rock deteriorate, rock erosion, and so on and so forth. So they really had to define, to agree on where the line was. And I'll leave the details about the sea boundary to you. There is no such thing as a natural boundary, just as there is no such thing as a natural traffic light. In 1907, Lord Curzon of Kettlestone, former British Viceroy of India under Queen Victoria and under King Edward VII, and future Secretary for Foreign Affairs under King George V, he gave the Romanes lecture at Oxford. Very important thing at that time. The topic he chose for his lecture was frontiers. And his lecture is, I strongly recommend it, is in many ways a milestone in the theoretical foundations of geopolitics as we know it today. It was the beginning. Frontiers are the razor's edge on which hang suspended the modern issues of war and peace, of life and death to nations. Just as the protection of the home is the most vital care of the private citizen, so the integrity of her borders is the condition of existence of the state. Sounds familiar, right? Right. And of course he devoted a great portion of his lecture to articulate and emphasize the political relevance of the difference between, on the one hand, those frontiers or boundaries that are afforded by nature, and those frontiers which, by contrast, have been artificially created by man. And surely that sounds like a nice distinction. It's an important distinction if we want to explain how things go, and if you want to explain how history went. Obviously, it's much easier to fight for a state or a country that claims to have natural boundaries, like Britain, I'm skipping the great on purpose, like Britain, than for a place that has totally artificial boundary. I never heard of an independentist party in Wyoming, for example. So surely the distinction is important and intuitive. But at the end of his lecture, he had to admit that there's also a third class, a class of so-called natural frontiers, which I have been obliged to admit as possessing no valid claim to the title, namely those boundaries which are claimed by nations as natural on grounds of ambition or expediency or more often sentiment. The attempt to realize frontiers of this type has been responsible for many of the wars and some of the most tragic vicissitudes in history. Exactly. But that is not a special case. That third class is not just, a minor thing that we, mention en passant at the end, which we are obliged to omit because we don't have time. That's the standard case. I think it's that way all the time. One of the most powerful and the most awful ways to make a frontier is to stamp it as a natural frontier. And we've been doing this all the time, and that's cheating. That's cheating, because natural it isn't, as the case of Italy and Switzerland actually shows. We must get rid of this damn rhetoric. We must understand what we're dealing with. We must remember what we are and where we live. this planet of ours, this silly little dot in this huge universe that has more stars than there are grains of sand on all our beaches. You know, if someone from outer space came and saw us fighting and killing each other over boundaries, they would think we're crazy. I think we're crazy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Achille. So once again, we have about 20 minutes, and then we really have to leave this room for questions. Anyone? Yeah.
Yeah, there's one question about one word that hasn't been mentioned here. I know that immigrants coming from different places are a variety of immigrants from different places, but there is something in Europe that is, flying around in the back that always sounds, which is the question of Islam. Whether the problem now in Asia is in some way political, but whatever, resounds under the question of Islam. When you put the question that you mentioned, multiculturalism, you put Islam, you have perfect storm. And obviously, the ones that can navigate the perfect storm are right wing. Left wing, the left wing, when you put it inside religion and the identity, they get confused. They have obviously nothing to add.
Anyone here? Carlo, you want to?
Yes, I think that's a fair question. But to see the problem of migration to the question of Islam, it's extremely reductionist because it does not take into account the post-colonial creation of the problem of Islam in Europe. That was not the problem, let's say, in the 60s with the Algerians or North Africans in Europe. It was not in the 70s with the Turks or the Kurds. It happens in a particular moment where Islam is constructed as the new anti-imperial project of a particular region. So to try to reduce it, it's like to use a traditional language or metaphor, it's a superficial, superstructural ideological effect. The real problem today is not the possibility of religious wars. That will be just to focus at the surface of things. The real dynamics are happening still in the material neoliberal organization of global economy. To focus now on religious wars as being our main problem in the world, I found it a bit like, how to call it, Harringtonianism from the left. And this, for example, the position of Zizek in the last 2-3 years. That migrants are Islamists and they threaten the human rights culture of Europe. That is again a clash of civilizations doctrine that's extremely, I think, inaccurate to understand the geopolitical issues that are involved in the question, into the issue, or in the question of migration.
Carlo?
No, but Andreas said what I would have said.
Right. Any more questions? Yaron?
So I know we're all the materials today, but since Caterina brought up the stop the boats, which is from where I come from, Australia, I would like to raise the question that Rui brought up at the end of the last panel, which was the suggestion that, apart from the connection between redistribution and the issue of migration, perhaps there are just some people who are ethnic-nationalists. And I'm wondering what the panel has to say about that kind of very anti-material suggestion that maybe some people, like much of Australia, are really just white nationalists. And how do we deal with them? Not on material level, not on moral level.
Yeah, and I was thinking before when we were talking with Rui about personal goods, public goods, like we kind of still remain in some sort of obscene world, especially now with like all of the populist like narratives about like protecting our lives or protecting our style of life and so on. So yeah, I guess that, I don't know if Carlo wanted to say something about so how do we...
Maybe there are some ethno-nationalists. But surely, those ones I agree with him, those ones you can't win. I think there are also many people who became ethno-nationalists because they were angry about other things. Or angry because there are real costs to immigration that are not taken into account by the way migration is dealt with now. There are people we cannot persuade and people we can persuade. The electorate of the left has been thinning, so those were not ethno-nationalists to begin with. So that would be my response.
But also one has to take into account that when it comes to the left, social democracy, the social democratic project, this great civilizational achievement, the 30 glorious years, was a nationalist project. Trotsky and Lenin were absolutely right on that issue. Social benefits for our citizens, for our connational, that was the idea. They defended the 1914, the idea to go to war against the international. So it's not by chance, maybe it's just a contextual historical argument, that social democratic parties in Europe since the 70s and the 80s had always a problem to understand the question of migration, because their loyalties, their imaginary was a statist nationalist imaginary. So social democratic benefits for us, social rights for us, not for others. So the idea of workers' internationalism was sacrificed in 1914, and we still pay that sacrifice today and its effects.
Yeah. Etienne?
Andreas, this is beautiful, of course, but it's not just an idea, it's a fact. And if you, we're not involved in 1914. We can cry, etc., because there was a revolution in 1917 which itself turned into one of the most nationalist constructions in recent history. So we have to take into account the effects of that history. And that's where I want, just in 1 minute, to connect with not only with what Achille beautifully said about borders, but also with what Carlo formula that he used, and I think it's very important, the idea that there are losers of globalization. And the question of the losers of globalization is, I totally agree with you, is a question of distribution. Now, what took place during the 20th century in one part of the world, but in fact this is a large part of the world, was a construction of what I personally, in a provocative manner, call the national social state. That is a state where class struggles, demands, even development strategies are reach certain effects, produce certain effects, gain certain benefits, etc., provided, that's perhaps horrible, but it's been the fact, provided this appears as the construction of a certain form of national state and national unity. So, what you describe as a catastrophe is also a fact to some extent. And then the problem is globalization now is dismantling that very, very strongly, very, very quickly. And that includes, of course, destabilizing the sacred borders, the national borders on which peoples had fought. The French and the German had killed each other around, and the British as well, etc. And the Italians, the border that was claimed natural, sacred, internalized, controlled, blah, 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 blah. But the fact is that at the end, to somehow compensate for the fact that so many millions of people had stupidly killed each other, the states on both sides organized something like social security within those borders. Now, of course, it's important to demonstrate that some people benefit more than others, but you also have to take into account the reasons why so many French, German, Italians, and so on, who are not on the upper side of the society, feel threatened by globalization. And they have certain reasons for that. And that leads to completely crazy representation. I agree with you, but that you would not easily surmount. Even the idea, I'm sure this does exist, that in some governments are benefiting from globalization, whereas they are losing all the time. So that's the great dilemma that had to face many other governments of history, when people who are disadvantaged are led to viewing others that are also disadvantaged as in fact in a better position than them.
Losers against losers. This is what they were able to do.
Any chance to think about that question before you answer? Thanks.
Hi, I want to refer to what Carlo said in your three arguments, and I'm a little worried about the hierarchy of the arguments, that the really important one is the economic one, and the others, not, he was talking about them not being convincing, but it sounded like he was saying more than that it's not the really central issue. We have to deal with redistribution. And that sounds like this old, the economic is the most important. And I think that's not true. The mixity argument isn't simply a matter of taste. If you do away with some kind of mixity, everybody's lives are in danger. Because today it's this group that isn't wanted, tomorrow it's that group that's not wanted. It's a fundamental commitment that everyone in these societies who may reject the argument really are committed to in their own lives, well-being, security, and so on. So it's not simply a matter of taste, it's a fundamental argument. I agree with you that there has to be some protection by those who may be in danger, but you know, they're not all, I mean, some people have suggested solutions to that. If indeed some group is in danger, then the state has to provide funds to provide retraining or whatever it is that will, you know, enable them to be economically well off. But I think a lot of people are not only worried about those economic dangers, they're worried about losing their culture, they're worried as in Hungary, the stories that Orban, you know, spread all over the walls and newspapers and everywhere. They're coming to get you. You know, that it was a physical danger. You know, they kill you or who knows what. To people who weren't afraid because there weren't any immigrants in them. You know, so it wasn't their lives or livelihood. It wasn't their livelihood that was in danger. So I think this hierarchy of arguments is, in effect, is really a problem. You know, if you don't want to be reductionist. And also, with Andreas, I agree that migration is one of the crucial or the crucial problem now. But it is the crucial problem because the right has made it the crucial problem. Because it's a useful argument for them. It's a useful issue to highlight. It's not only a real problem, it's an ideological issue that the right has, you know, put up there.
Thanks. Carlo and Andreas.
Very briefly. Let me be very clear about this. I agree with everything you said. I didn't intend the hierarchy whereby the economic is the true argument. In fact, personally, I would think if there is a hierarchy, it would be the other way around. I think for me, the basic reason why I want migration is the aesthetic reason. I like an open society and whatever. But what I was talking about was the persuasive power of these arguments with people who don't already agree. I find, maybe you have a different experience, persuading people that mixity is beautiful, if they're not already convinced of that, very difficult. I find telling them that actually it's in your interest to get the migrants gets you further as a political question, like as a question of persuasion. So if there is a hierarchy for me, I'm for migration because I like an open society. I find that argument has very little purchasing power in political terms.
But I wouldn't put the mixity argument in the way that you're putting it. You're putting it as though you like diversity, you like difference. That's not what the argument should be. The argument should be if you start saying we don't want them, we only want us, then the question becomes who's us?
and trying to tell them then they're coming for you. Maybe, but it's an
The argument is that it's more pragmatic, that purity is dangerous. So you try to tell them that if you are for purity, it will at some point it might become a danger to you, because who will decide what is the criteria of purity? Political beliefs, race, blood, religion. So the argument is a pragmatic realist, prudential argument, not a matter of taste or aesthetic.
To that extent, I find it perhaps more persuasive.
Yeah. Sorry, we have 10 minutes and 2 questions to go. Like, also, I just wanted to add that probably on top of these 3 dimensions, or at least one of these 3 dimensions, so a 4th one should also be the legality one, the legal one, which, I mean, David, and if you want to say something more about that, but it was kind of like, I mean, we can probably not justify, but understand the points of view, different points of view, nationalist points of view against diversity, etc. But it's very difficult to somehow justify, like, just going against the law, against all of the treaties, the UN Convention, and the sea treaties you were talking about before. Like, that is really difficult to justify, no matter what the point of view is. So, Rui, and then right behind, or the opposite. I mean, talking. Okay. No, it's just take the microphone in here. No.
As I was listening there, one of the things that struck me is that migration of people is the last frontier. The last frontier. Why I'm saying so is that money crosses borders without trade, certain type of people. There's not a problem in terms of migration. And I feel that maybe within that is the answer. In other words, through trade, there must be some reciprocity. I'm not sure. It struck me that for us to cross that last frontier, it has to be tied into the things we do now.
Thanks, Roy. Sorry.
I just wanted to ask you to touch on the paradox that freedom of movement is not unpopular in Europe. It is the most popular element of the European Union is freedom of movement, which is very curious. In Hungary, the most popular element of the European Union is freedom of movement. Freedom of movement of the Hungarians across the European space. And we can, and more, not the other way around, but maybe the solution, we already touched on this with redistribution. The European Union has been an experiment in regulating migration by opening borders in the most counterintuitive way. I know this because I came from a country where lots of people migrated, Portugal. In the 60s, in the 70s, when did people stop migrating? When the border was open. Because it was opening the border plus redistribution, lots of money coming from the European Union to Portugal. Then, when with austerity, redistribution ceased, people started migrating again. But actually, I think that the fact that people have forgotten that borders were once closed, and that nowadays they have open borders, and curiously, Romania is not empty after the borders were open. Romania is growing by 7 or 8%, and people migrated in the beginning and are staying in Romania. So, I think that we have a paradox. Europeans adore freedom of movement, but it has become transparent. Freedom of movement that was not transparent 30 or 40 years ago. It was kind of forgotten. And that the compound, open borders plus redistribution has been much more effective in regulating intra-European migration that you had a lot, and then you stopped having, and now you have again with austerity. It's much more effective than putting the border. The Portuguese were crossing the borders, 2 borders, crossing the Pyrenees, were crossing the Atlantic to go to Brazil.
But really it seems that like the only way to protect Schengen and the freedom of movement in the Schengen area is to just externalize the European borders. Really, this is what it seems more and more. I don't know, we can discuss that later. Achille and David.
Well, I wanted to actually go back quickly to the previous exchange, if I may. I actually liked the way Carlo presented the issues in terms of arguments which can be effective, which arguments are likely to be more effective, etc. And I just wanted to make two quick comments. The first is that I think some of the arguments which, I think correctly, as a matter of contingent fact, you describe as being totally ineffective, for example, or to begin with, the aesthetic argument, could actually be improved. The people who will not be convinced by that argument, the diversity, how beautiful diversity is, are the very same people, I bet this is 100% true, are the very same people who of course think that North Korea is terrible because they're all dressed the same, they all live in the same houses, and so they're completely indistinguishable from one another. The very same people who thought that communist China was terrible because everybody was the same. So look, they obviously live in a contradiction. An argument should simply reveal the contradiction and say, look, if in this room we were all the same, it would be a damn boring world. Anyway, the second point is that regardless of what I just said, of whether what I've just said is a way to go, I think here and from now on, we should take what you said as a challenge, not to elaborate even stronger version of the economic argument, because that is the one that seems to be working better. But on the contrary, to actually focus on better ways to come up with arguments of the first and second sort. Precisely because I think most of us, especially those of us who stayed up to this time, 8:20 or whatever it is, are people who are moved by the first line of argument and the second. So the fact that we can't convince them doesn't mean that we... It simply means that we haven't done a good job, and so let's do that job, as opposed to other things. That was my second point. Thank you. Sorry.
David, and then we're done.
And then one point, I think in this discussion, also in the Q&A, many people ask about, but there are people who are really hardcore nationalists, they cannot be persuaded. I think that one question that we should ask ourselves is, who are we talking about? I think a generational dynamic should be taken into account. So, for example, if you ask people in their 50s or 60s, I guess, whether they feel more Italian or more attached to their regional identity or more European, the answer that you get might probably differ from the answer that you might get from a student who's 23, 24, who has experienced Erasmus. So I think that the fact that we need to take into consideration this difference between different generational experiences might change the kind of answers that we might get and the kind of perspective that we might offer over the same problem.
I just wanted to add one note on this proposition of the Charter 2020, which seems to me very interesting. When Patriarca, in the last interview he did right before dying, he had to say what was Charter 77. He eventually said it was about legality. It was about respecting legality and respecting the laws that we had in Czechoslovakia. So I think there is also like some kind of like empty political space of like really legality laws and jurisdiction. So that's probably what we should fill in the future. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.